January 7, 1945. 10:47 a.m. Zonhoven, Belgium. A British field marshal raises a pistol and fires a single shot into the frozen Belgian air. The sound cracks across the courtyard like a whip. Reporters flinch. Cameras click. Bernard Montgomery grins wide, satisfied, theatrical, and holsters the weapon. He does it before every press conference. A little show, a reminder of who is in charge. Today, however, that theatrical pistol shot will trigger something far more destructive than a bullet. Today, Montgomery is about to fire a verbal broadside that will shake the entire Allied coalition to its foundation, infuriate every American general in Europe, and force the most powerful prime minister in British history to personally clean up the wreckage. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historical events, and unforgettable moments from the past. We're building a community of history lovers, and we want you in it. In the next 60 minutes, Montgomery will say words that are still quoted in military history classrooms today. Words so arrogant, so tone-deaf, so catastrophically mistimed that they almost shattered the Anglo-American alliance at the very moment the Allies were on the verge of final victory. And 11 days later, Winston Churchill himself will stand before the House of Commons and publicly demolish everything Montgomery claimed in the most precise, devastating, diplomatically lethal speech of the entire war. This is the story of the worst press conference in the history of World War II. This is the story of what Churchill said when Montgomery took credit for saving the Americans. And it begins not in January 1945, but 3 weeks earlier, in the dark frozen forests of the Ardennes, where 80,000 American soldiers were about to be swallowed by the most catastrophic surprise attack the United States Army had ever suffered. December 16, 1944. The war was supposed to be almost over. Allied commanders across Europe believed Germany was finished. The Wehrmacht had been pushed back on every front. Paris was liberated. Rome had fallen. The Reich was bleeding from both east and west. American troops were exhausted but confident. Along a quiet, thinly defended stretch of front in the Ardennes forest, a region considered too rugged, too dense, too impractical for a major offensive, American divisions were resting and rotating. Some units were fresh replacements. Others were veterans pulled back from brutal fighting to recuperate. Nobody expected anything serious to happen here. They were wrong. At 5:30 in the morning, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front. The sound was so enormous that soldiers 40 miles away jolted awake from deep sleep. Snow blew sideways through the trees. Visibility dropped to almost zero. And then, out of that screaming white darkness, came 28 German divisions, 250,000 soldiers, tanks, artillery, and armored half-tracks smashing into American positions with a ferocity that nobody in the Allied High Command had believed was still possible. The Germans called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would later call it the Battle of the Bulge. History would call it the single greatest land battle ever fought by the United States Army. In the first 72 hours, entire American regiments were overrun. Communications collapsed. Supply lines were cut. Headquarters were evacuated under fire. German special forces in American uniforms penetrated deep behind Allied lines, switching road signs, cutting telephone wires, and spreading panic. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh, inexperienced, barely weeks in the field, was virtually destroyed as a fighting unit. Over 8,000 men surrendered in a single day, the largest mass surrender of American troops since the Civil War. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, received the news at his headquarters in Versailles and immediately understood the scale of the catastrophe. This was not a local counterattack. This was a strategic offensive designed to punch through American lines, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. If it succeeded, the war in the West could drag on for another year or longer. Hundreds of thousands more would die. Eisenhower made several decisions in rapid succession, each one consequential. He ordered armored reserves forward, including the famous 101st Airborne Division, which was rushed to the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne without winter clothing, without adequate ammunition, and without artillery support. He canceled offensive operations elsewhere and redirected every available resource to plugging the breach. And on December 20th, 1944, he made the decision that would create the political firestorm that is the subject of this story. Because the German attack had physically split American forces, cutting communications between General Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the American 1st and 9th Armies to the north, Eisenhower transferred temporary command of all Allied forces north of the German breakthrough to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his 21st Army Group headquarters. It was a practical decision. Montgomery was geographically closer. His communications infrastructure was intact. He could coordinate the northern defensive effort more effectively than Bradley could across a broken front. Eisenhower made this absolutely clear in his orders: temporary tactical geographic, nothing more. Montgomery saw it differently. Bernard Law. Montgomery was by any objective measure one of the most capable battlefield commanders of the Second World War. He was also one of the most insufferable human beings in the history of the British Army. His ego was not merely large, it was architectural. It had rooms in it. It had corridors, staircases, and a lobby where lesser men could wait to be received. Montgomery genuinely believed with a certainty that bordered on religious conviction that he was the finest military mind among all Allied commanders, that American generalship was fundamentally inferior to British generalship, and that Eisenhower was a political soldier rather than a real warrior. He had believed this since the moment he arrived in North Africa in 1942. He had never stopped believing it. So when Eisenhower handed him command of American forces north of the Bulge, Montgomery did not interpret this as a practical administrative arrangement born of geographic necessity. He interpreted it as confirmation, proof, validation of everything he had always known. The Americans had gotten themselves into trouble, and once again, the British had been called in to sort it out. This was the narrative that formed in Montgomery's mind, and it was the narrative he was about to share with the world's press. Over the next 2 weeks, the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its resolution. The crisis at Bastogne became legendary. When German commanders demanded the 101st Airborne's surrender, American General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a reply that contained exactly one word: nuts. The surrounded Americans held fighting in brutal conditions with dwindling ammunition and no winter gear until General George Patton's Third Army broke through from the south on December 26th, a feat of logistical and tactical improvisation that military historians still study in detail. The German offensive stalled. Allied air power freed by clearing skies after Christmas devastated German supply columns and armored formations. By early January 1945, the Bulge was being slowly erased. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 80,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 19,000 Americans died, more American deaths in a single battle than in the entire Pacific campaign up to that point. British casualties totaled around 1,400. The math was brutal and undeniable. This had been almost entirely an American battle fought by American soldiers paid for in American blood. Montgomery knew these numbers. He did not seem to think they were particularly relevant. January 7, 1945. Zonhoven, Belgium. The reporters fill the room at Montgomery's headquarters. Notebooks open. Pencils ready. The Field Marshal strides in wearing his signature beret with its 2 badges, the General Officer Badge and the badge of the Royal Tank Regiment. He is relaxed. He is confident. He is, by multiple contemporary accounts, almost jovial. He gestures at maps. He uses a pointer. He tells the story of the battle. His story of the battle, and he tells it magnificently in the sense that a magnificent lie is still a lie. According to the official transcript and the accounts of every journalist in that room, Montgomery described how the German attack had created a dangerous situation and how he had been given command of American forces to resolve it. He said, "As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river." He described deploying reserves, organizing defensive positions, thinking ahead, while others panicked. He called the battle most interesting, and described it as possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled, as if it were his personal chess match against a worthy opponent, rather than a brutal attritional struggle paid for almost entirely by American lives. He said the first thing he had done was to tidy up the mess and regroup American and British forces. He praised American soldiers, and then destroyed that praise with a single sentence. "The GIs make great fighting men," Montgomery said, "given the proper leadership." The room went quiet for a moment. Every American correspondent present understood exactly what had just been said. American soldiers were fine. Their leadership was the problem. And Montgomery had arrived to provide the proper leadership they had been lacking. He had essentially claimed credit for saving the Americans from their own commanders on the record in front of the international press while the battle was still barely over. The reaction was immediate, explosive, unprecedented in the history of Allied cooperation. General Omar Bradley read the press reports the next morning and telephoned Eisenhower in a fury. According to Bradley's own memoir, he told Eisenhower flatly if Montgomery was not immediately removed from command of American forces, he would resign. This was not a negotiating tactic. Bradley meant it. Patton, reading the same reports, recorded his contempt in his diary with language that cannot be repeated here. American newspapers exploded with outrage. Congress received protests. The War Department in Washington began receiving demands that American troops be pulled out of British command entirely. Eisenhower found himself trapped between his subordinates, unable to publicly contradict Montgomery without creating a diplomatic crisis with Britain, unable to stay silent without triggering a revolt among his American commanders. In London, Winston Churchill read the reports and understood immediately what was at stake. Not just military prestige, not just hurt feelings. The Anglo-American alliance itself, the partnership that was the foundational architecture of the entire Allied war effort, was fracturing in real time because one British Field Marshal could not control his ego at a press conference. Churchill's Chief of Staff, Alan Brooke, recorded in his diary that Churchill was furious. Not publicly furious, Churchill was too skilled for that, but privately, genuinely furious. Because Churchill understood something Montgomery apparently did not. Britain needed America far more than America needed Britain. The Lend-Lease lifeline, the millions of American soldiers on British soil, the shared intelligence networks, the combined bombing campaign, the entire Western strategy, all of it depended on a relationship of mutual respect between two sovereign nations. Montgomery had just publicly humiliated the senior partner. Churchill began preparing his response. It would come 11 days later in the House of Commons, and it would be one of the most carefully constructed pieces of diplomatic surgery in the history of parliamentary oratory. He was going to give credit to the Americans, specific statistical undeniable credit, and he was going to do it in a way that gently, devastatingly, unmistakably corrected Montgomery's narrative without ever once mentioning Montgomery's name. But before Churchill could speak, before the alliance could be repaired, something had to happen first. Eisenhower had to decide what to do about Montgomery. Bradley's threat of resignation sat on his desk like a grenade with the pin already pulled. And from Washington, signals were arriving that suggested the War Department itself was losing patience with the British Field Marshal. The question was simple and brutal. Was Bernard Montgomery worth the alliance? In Part 2, we will enter the inner chambers of Allied command, where Eisenhower faced the most difficult personnel decision of the entire war, where Churchill crafted every single word of his parliamentary speech with surgical precision, and where Montgomery, oblivious to the catastrophe he had created, was already planning his next press conference. Montgomery had fired his pistol into the Belgian air and walked into that press conference believing he was about to cement his legacy. Instead, he had lit a fuse. By the morning of January 8, 1945, that fuse was burning through the highest levels of Allied command, and nobody, Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not the War Department in Washington knew exactly how much explosive was at the other end. The number that mattered most was not on any battle map. It was a single telephone call. One call from Omar Bradley to Dwight Eisenhower, carrying a threat so serious that if it was acted upon, it would functionally destroy the American command structure in Europe at the exact moment the Allies were preparing their final offensive into Germany. Bradley had said the words clearly, "Remove Montgomery from command of American forces, or accept my resignation." And Bradley was not a man who made empty threats. Eisenhower sat with that call for 48 hours. The weight of it was almost incomprehensible. On one side, Montgomery, the British coalition partner, the Field Marshal Churchill, personally championed the commander whose 21st Army Group held the northern flank of the entire Allied line. On the other side, Bradley, commander of 12 American divisions, the officer Eisenhower trusted more than almost anyone else in the theater. And behind Bradley, invisible but unmistakable, the entire institutional fury of the United States Army. The morning of January 9th, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, walked into the Supreme Commander's office and placed a cable on the desk. It was from the War Department in Washington. Congressional representatives were demanding answers. The cable did not use diplomatic language. It used the language of men who had constituents, and those constituents had sons in foxholes in Belgium, and those sons had been publicly described by a British general as soldiers who required proper British leadership to function effectively. Eisenhower called Montgomery directly. The conversation, reconstructed from both men's memoirs and the accounts of staff officers present on Montgomery's end, was controlled but unmistakably firm. Eisenhower told Montgomery that the press conference had caused serious damage. Montgomery, according to multiple accounts, expressed genuine puzzlement. He had praised the American soldiers, he said. He had called them great fighting men. What exactly was the problem? Monty Eisenhower reportedly said, "You told the world that Americans needed you to clean up their mess. That is the problem." Montgomery was silent for a moment. Then he said, he had been misunderstood. Eisenhower did not argue. He simply told Montgomery that command arrangements were being reconsidered and that Bradley would resume authority over First Army imminently. Montgomery accepted this without protest, which suggested to those who knew him that he still did not fully comprehend the scale of what he had done. He thought this was about military bureaucracy. It was actually about whether Britain and America would finish the war as partners or as adversaries. The decision to return First Army to Bradley's command was announced on January 17th. It partially satisfied Bradley. It did not satisfy the American press, the American public, or the 40 members of Congress who had already drafted letters demanding formal inquiry into British conduct. The political wound was still open and bleeding. And Churchill, watching from London with the alarm of a man who understood that empires are built on relationships, understood that only one person could close it. He would have to do it himself. In Parliament. On the record. In front of the world. Churchill spent several days preparing his January 18th speech with a precision that was almost architectural. Every word was chosen not just for what it said, but for what it would prevent others from saying afterward. He needed to give the Americans full credit for the Battle of the Bulge, unambiguous, statistical, irrefutable credit, while simultaneously protecting Montgomery from being named and publicly humiliated, because humiliating Montgomery meant humiliating Britain, and Britain could not afford that either. The speech had to be a correction without being an accusation, a vindication without being an attack, a diplomatic masterpiece delivered in the plain language of arithmetic. January 18th, 1945. The House of Commons. Churchill rose to speak, and the chamber fell immediately quiet. Members who had been expecting a routine wartime update sensed from his posture, from something in the set of his jaw, that this was different. He began with the battle itself. He described the German offensive, its scale, its shock. He acknowledged that the situation had been serious, and then, with the methodical precision of a lawyer presenting evidence, he began dismantling Montgomery's narrative without once using Montgomery's name. I have seen it suggested. Churchill said that the terrific battle which has been proceeding since December 16th on the American front is an Anglo-American battle. He paused. The chamber was completely silent. In fact, however, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. He let that sentence stand alone for a moment before continuing. They have suffered losses almost equal to those on both sides in the Battle of Gettysburg. Only one British Army Corps has been engaged in this action. All the rest of the 30 or more divisions which have been fighting continuously for the last month are United States troops. The numbers landed like artillery rounds. 30 divisions, 1 British Corps. Every journalist in the press gallery was writing furiously. Every member of Parliament understood exactly what was happening. Churchill was publicly correcting the record, not gently, not with diplomatic hedging, but with specific numbers that made any alternative interpretation mathematically impossible. He was not finished. The Americans have engaged 30 to 40 men for every one we have engaged, Churchill continued, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours. 60 to 80 American lives for every British life. That was not an impression or an interpretation. That was arithmetic. And arithmetic could not be argued with in the pages of British newspapers or American congressional hearings. Then came the sentence that every historian has quoted since the sentence that was aimed with surgical precision at Montgomery's press conference without ever leaving a visible fingerprint. Care must be taken, Churchill said, in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. Care must be taken. 4 words. A warning, a rebuke, and a correction simultaneously, and because Montgomery's name was never spoken. Montgomery could not respond to it publicly without confirming that the warning had been directed at him. Churchill had constructed a trap that worked regardless of whether Montgomery walked into it or not. He followed this with explicit personal public endorsement of Eisenhower because Montgomery's press conference had implied without quite stating that Eisenhower's judgment had been found wanting and British command had been required to compensate. Churchill obliterated that implication directly. I have been shocked, he said, to hear suggestions that the Supreme Commander General Eisenhower has been overruled by the British or that his judgment has been questioned. General Eisenhower has conducted this battle with great skill and determination. And then, to close every possible exit for future revisionism. I have complete confidence in General Eisenhower. The speech lasted less than 20 minutes in this section. It did not need to be longer. Churchill had accomplished in 4 paragraphs what no diplomatic cable, no private meeting, no carefully worded communique could have accomplished. He had publicly permanently on the official parliamentary record established that the Battle of the Bulge was an American victory, that the Americans had done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses, and that any British claim to credit beyond its actual contribution was excessive and in need of correction. American newspapers reported the speech within hours. The reaction across the Atlantic was immediate and measurable. The congressional letters began to stop. The War Department cables changed in tone. Bradley read the speech and recorded in his memoir that Churchill had said what needed to be said, even if it had taken 11 days longer than it should have. Patton wrote in his diary on January 19th, Churchill tried to fix what Monty broke. He nearly did. Nearly. That word from Patton was significant, because while Churchill's speech repaired the public wound, the private damage among American commanders was permanent. Bradley never trusted Montgomery again, not professionally, not personally. Eisenhower, who had worked harder than any man in Europe to maintain genuine partnership between British and American command, wrote in his memoir that Montgomery's press conference was an unnecessary complication at a critical time. Eisenhower's version of fury expressed in the controlled language of a man who had spent 4 years learning to be diplomatic about things that made him want to throw furniture. And Montgomery himself. He read Churchill's speech. He understood finally that something significant had happened. According to accounts from his staff, he was quieter than usual for several days. But when he published his memoirs 13 years later in 1958, he maintained that his press conference had been misunderstood, that the controversy had been blown out of proportion by sensitive Americans, and that he had genuinely meant to praise the GIs. He had spent 13 years thinking about it and still did not understand why his words had caused the damage they caused. That gap between intent and impact, Montgomery's complete inability to see through the eyes of the people he was speaking about, was perhaps the most revealing fact of the entire episode. Churchill had saved the alliance. But the alliance he saved was not quite the same alliance that had existed before January 7th. Something had been damaged that no parliamentary speech, however brilliant, could completely restore. The Americans had learned something about their British counterparts that they would not forget when the war ended and the post-war world began to take shape. And Britain had learned something about itself, that its days of being able to speak from a position of automatic superiority over its American partners were already over, even if not everyone in the British military had received that message yet. The war in Europe had 5 months left. Germany would surrender in May. The alliance would hold together long enough to finish the job, but the ground beneath it had shifted, and everyone who was paying attention could feel it. There was one more consequence of Montgomery's press conference that has received less attention than it deserves. In the weeks after Churchill's speech, as the furor gradually subsided, Eisenhower finalized his plans for the final Allied offensive into Germany. Those plans gave Montgomery's 21st Army Group a significantly less prominent role than Montgomery had expected or wanted. Whether that was purely strategic or partly personal, Eisenhower never said directly. He did not need to. Montgomery would cross the Rhine. He would advance into northern Germany. He would accept the surrender of German forces in northwestern Europe on May 4, 1945, one of the most significant moments of the war. But he would do it as one commander among several, not as the dominant figure he had imagined himself to be after the Bulge. The pistol shot over Zonhoven had echoed further than he knew. And in Part 3, we will follow that echo into the final months of the war, where Montgomery made one last attempt to seize the initiative, where Eisenhower made the decision that would define the shape of post-war Europe, and where Churchill, exhausted and increasingly aware that Britain's world was ending, even as the war was being won, faced a choice that haunts historians to this day. Churchill's speech had closed the public wound. The numbers he delivered to Parliament on January 18th were surgical and final: 30 American divisions, 1 British corps, 60 to 80 American lives for every British life. No newspaper could argue with arithmetic. No politician could reframe those ratios. The Anglo-American alliance survived visibly intact, publicly endorsed by the most credible voice in Britain. But survival and health are different things. And in the final months of World War II in Europe, the damage Montgomery had inflicted on Allied trust would ripple outward in ways nobody had fully anticipated, reshaping command decisions, redirecting entire armies, and ultimately determining which flag would fly over Berlin. By February 1945, German intelligence analysts had reconstructed with painful accuracy exactly what Montgomery's press conference had done to Allied unity. German High Command received reports within 2 weeks of the press conference describing the fury among American generals, Bradley's resignation threat, and the emergency nature of Churchill's parliamentary intervention. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the West, reportedly told his staff that the Allies were fighting each other almost as hard as they were fighting Germany. Model was wrong about the degree. He was not entirely wrong about the direction. What German intelligence missed, and what would prove fatal to any German hope of exploiting Allied divisions, was the speed with which Eisenhower moved to restructure command arrangements after the crisis. By February 1st, First Army had been returned to Bradley. By February 10th, Eisenhower had finalized his operational plan for the final drive into Germany. And that plan contained a decision so consequential, so strategically significant, that it would define the shape of post-war Europe for the next 50 years. Montgomery would not lead the primary Allied thrust. The main effort would go to Bradley's 12th Army Group in the center. Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north would conduct a supporting operation, important but secondary. Montgomery was furious. He had spent months arguing that the Allies needed a single concentrated thrust into northern Germany, led by his forces aimed at Berlin. He believed this was the correct strategy. He may even have been right about the strategy. But he had spent the same months making it politically impossible for Eisenhower to give him what he wanted, because giving Montgomery the primary role after January 7th would have been interpreted by every American commander in Europe as a capitulation to British arrogance. Eisenhower could not do it. Bradley would have resigned. Patton would have been uncontrollable. The alliance, already stressed, would have fractured along its deepest fault line. Montgomery appealed directly to Churchill. This was, militarily speaking, an extraordinary breach of the chain of command. A field marshal asking the Prime Minister to override the Supreme Allied Commander's operational decisions. Churchill listened. Churchill understood the military argument. Churchill then did something that demonstrated more clearly than anything else how completely he had absorbed the lesson of the press conference crisis. He told Montgomery no, not because Churchill thought Eisenhower's broad front strategy was necessarily superior to Montgomery's single thrust concept. Churchill had his own doubts about the broad front approach. He said no because he understood that the political cost of overriding Eisenhower at this stage, 11 weeks after the press conference disaster, with American generals still barely contained, would be higher than any strategic benefit Montgomery's plan might deliver. The relationship had to come first. The war was already won. What mattered now was how it ended and who would be standing next to whom when it did. Montgomery received Churchill's refusal, and in a gesture that suggested he had finally partially begun to understand what had happened to him, accepted it without further appeal. He submitted to Eisenhower's plan. He prepared his forces for the Rhine crossing that would be assigned to 21st Army Group Operation Plunder, one of the largest river crossing operations in military history. March 23, 1945. The Rhine River. Northern Germany. Montgomery's operation began at 10 o'clock at night with an artillery bombardment from 3,500 guns firing simultaneously along a 25-mile front. The sound was heard in Amsterdam. The sky over the Rhine turned orange and stayed orange for 4 hours. 21st Army Group crossed the river in assault boats, while German defenders, already weakened by months of retreat and attrition, struggled to organize coherent resistance in the dark and the noise and the fire. By dawn on March 24th, British and Canadian forces had established bridgeheads on the eastern bank. American forces from 9th Army, still technically part of Montgomery's command for this operation, crossed alongside them. The operation was massive, coordinated, professionally executed. Montgomery had prepared it for months, with characteristic thoroughness, every detail rehearsed, every contingency planned, every unit briefed to redundancy. It was also, by the standards of what American forces were achieving simultaneously to the south, somewhat beside the point. While Montgomery was planning and preparing and coordinating his set-piece Rhine crossing with elaborate care, Patton's Third Army had already crossed the Rhine 9 days earlier, on March 14th at Oppenheim, without preparation, without announcement, almost without casualty, in a spontaneous exploitation of a German defensive gap that Patton had identified and immediately attacked. When Patton called Bradley to report the crossing, he said, "Don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Then he paused and added, "And I've been pissing in the Rhine for 10 minutes. By the time Montgomery's carefully orchestrated crossing began on March 23rd, Patton was 60 miles east of the river. This contrast, Montgomery's methodical professionalism versus Patton's aggressive improvisation, was not merely a matter of personality. It reflected the fundamental strategic argument that the press conference crisis had made impossible to resolve rationally. Both approaches had merit. Both had costs. But the political damage of January 7th had ensured that the argument would be settled not on its military merits, but on the basis of which commanders Eisenhower could politically afford to favor. Eisenhower could afford to favor Bradley and Patton. He could not, after the press conference, afford the appearance of favoring Montgomery. The American drives across central Germany accelerated through April with a speed that astonished even their own commanders. Patton's forces covered 30 miles a day through terrain that military doctrine said should require weeks to traverse. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, not just retreating but disintegrating. Units surrendering wholesale command structures, dissolving soldiers, abandoning equipment, and walking west toward American lines, rather than east toward Soviet ones. By April 11th, American forces reached the Elbe River 60 miles from Berlin. They stopped there per Eisenhower's orders and waited for the Soviets coming from the east. The decision to halt at the Elbe to let Berlin fall to the Soviet Union, rather than drive for it with American forces, was perhaps the most consequential single decision Eisenhower made in the entire war. It shaped the Cold War. It determined the division of Germany. It established the Iron Curtain along lines that would hold for 45 years. And it was a decision that Montgomery, had he been in the position he wanted, had he not destroyed his political capital at a press conference in January, might have been able to influence. He had argued for driving to Berlin. He might have been right. But he had made himself impossible to trust with the mission. Churchill understood this with a clarity that was almost painful. He argued strenuously in cables to Eisenhower and to Roosevelt that Berlin mattered politically, symbolically, strategically, and that allowing the Soviets to take it would hand them an advantage in the post-war settlement that would be nearly impossible to overcome. Eisenhower disagreed on military grounds, and Roosevelt declined to override him. Berlin fell to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945. The political consequences unfolded exactly as Churchill had predicted. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in northwestern Europe on May 4 on Lüneburg Heath from a small delegation of German officers who arrived at his headquarters in a state of visible exhaustion and defeat. It was a significant moment. Montgomery conducted it with dignity and professional formality. No press conferences, no theatrical pistol shots, no claims about whose leadership had made the victory possible. He had learned something. It was 4 months late and had cost him. Berlin had cost him the primary role in the final offensive, had nearly cost Britain its most important alliance. But he had learned something. Churchill lost the general election on July 5, 1945, before the war against Japan had even ended, replaced as Prime Minister by Clement Attlee, while the victory celebrations were still echoing through London. The British public, exhausted and economically devastated, voted for welfare reform rather than wartime leadership. Churchill accepted the verdict with the grace of a man who had expected it, which made it no less painful. He had spent 5.5 years holding an alliance together through crises that would have shattered lesser coalitions: the fall of France, the fall of Singapore, the North Africa disasters, the disagreements over strategy in Italy and France, the arguments over bombing policy, and finally, in the last winter of the war, a British Field Marshal's ego threatening to unravel everything at the moment of approaching victory. Churchill had managed all of it. He had said the right things at the right moments. He had sacrificed Montgomery diplomatically to preserve what Montgomery had threatened to destroy. The alliance held. The war was won. And then the voters sent Churchill home. He sat down that July and began writing his memoirs. 6 volumes, 4,000 pages, a masterwork of historical self-presentation that would win him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. In those pages, Churchill described the Battle of the Bulge, the press conference crisis, and his parliamentary speech with the measured tone of a man recounting events that had been resolved satisfactorily, if not without difficulty. Montgomery's press conference received 3 paragraphs. Churchill's parliamentary response received 7. The numbers were in their way a final verdict. But the man who had fired that pistol into the Belgian air on January 7, 1945, the man who had walked into that room believing he was about to tell the world the story of his greatest triumph, was still alive, still writing, still thinking about what had happened. And what he believed about it would surprise almost everyone who read it when his memoirs finally appeared in 1958, because Montgomery, after 13 years of reflection, still thought he had been misunderstood. What he wrote in those memoirs, and what it reveals about the gap between his self-perception and historical reality, is a story that has fascinated historians ever since. And the final chapter of this story, the legacy, the verdicts, and the question of what it all ultimately meant, is something that requires its own examination. Because the real lesson of Churchill and Montgomery and the Battle of the Bulge press conference is not simply about ego or alliance management or diplomatic skill. It is about something much larger, much more enduring, and much more relevant to how nations and leaders navigate power and partnership in a world where no single country can win alone. That lesson, and the full accounting of what these men left behind, is what Part 4 will finally deliver. 3 months before Germany surrendered, Churchill stood in Parliament and told the truth about who had bled and died in the Ardennes. Montgomery crossed the Rhine with 3,500 guns and the full weight of British military professionalism. Eisenhower let Bradley and Patton drive east, while holding Montgomery to a supporting role that history would record as secondary. Berlin fell to the Soviets, and the war ended on May 8, 1945, with the Anglo-American alliance intact but permanently altered, older, more cautious, stripped of the easy mutual confidence that had existed before a British Field Marshal picked up a pistol in Belgium and decided to tell the world how he had saved the Americans from themselves. What happened to these men afterward is a story that most accounts of the Battle of the Bulge neglect entirely. It is also in some ways the most revealing chapter of all. Bernard Montgomery was promoted to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the British Army, in September 1944, before the press conference before any of the damage. The promotion stood. His reputation in Britain remained largely intact because British newspapers had reported his press conference very differently than American ones, and because most British readers never fully understood the scale of the fury it had generated on the other side of the Atlantic. Montgomery became Chief of the Imperial General Staff in 1946, the professional head of the British Army. He served in that role until 1948. He became Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO from 1951 to 1958. He was made Viscount Montgomery of Alamein. He received honors and titles and ceremonial positions that accumulated around him like armor. He also never stopped being himself. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Montgomery continued to say precisely what he thought about anyone whose military judgment he considered inferior to his own, which included most people. He criticized Eisenhower's wartime strategy in lectures and interviews. He questioned American military doctrine. He remained to the end of his professional life utterly convinced that his own judgment had been correct on every major decision of the war, and that history would eventually vindicate him on all points. Then, in 1958, he published his memoirs, and he wrote about the press conference. He wrote that it had been misunderstood. He wrote that he had genuinely meant to praise the American soldier. He wrote that the controversy had been disproportionate, driven by American sensitivity rather than British fault. 13 years of reflection had not moved him a single inch. The man who had nearly shattered the most important military alliance in human history still believed in 1958 that the problem had been with his audience rather than with himself. He died in 1976 at 88 years old, having never once publicly acknowledged that he had made a serious error on January 7, 1945. Omar Bradley, who had threatened to resign over the incident, went on to become a 5-star general of the Army and the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He outlived Montgomery by 6 years, dying in 1981 at 88. In his memoirs published in 1951, he wrote about Montgomery with a restraint that was itself a form of contempt, acknowledging his capabilities while leaving the reader in no doubt about his personal assessment of the man's character. Bradley never forgave and never forgot, but he also never let the personal bitterness interfere with his professional conduct. That discipline was in its way a form of greatness. George Patton did not live to write his full account. He died on December 21, 1945, 13 days after a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. The diary entries he left behind, including his fury at Montgomery's press conference, and his grudging acknowledgement that Churchill had tried to repair the damage were published posthumously. Patton is remembered today primarily as a battlefield commander of almost supernatural aggression and effectiveness. What is less remembered is that his fury at Montgomery in January 1945 was not personal vanity. It was the fury of a man who had watched American soldiers die in conditions of genuine heroism while a British general prepared to claim credit for their sacrifice in front of the international press. Patton was right to be angry. He was sometimes right for the wrong reasons, but on this specific matter he was simply right. Dwight Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States in 1953, serving 2 terms until 1961. In the White House, he navigated the early Cold War with the same quality he had displayed as Supreme Allied Commander, a calm strategic patience that was frequently underestimated by those who mistook steadiness for passivity. He wrote his memoirs, acknowledged the difficulties of managing Allied coalition warfare, and described Montgomery's press conference as an unnecessary complication. He remained diplomatically careful about Montgomery in print, which is itself a testimony to how seriously he continued to take the responsibility of managing the relationship between nations, even decades after the fact. Winston Churchill lost the 1945 election, returned as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his historical writings, and died on January 24, 1965, at 90 years old. His parliamentary speech of January 18, 1945, is studied today in diplomatic history courses as a masterclass in corrective public communication. How to repair institutional damage through precisely calibrated public statement without escalating the underlying conflict. The speech is not famous the way his wartime addresses are famous. It does not have a memorable title or a single phrase that is passed into common usage. But among historians of Anglo-American relations, it is considered one of the most consequential things he ever said, precisely because of what it prevented rather than what it created. The legacy of this episode extends far beyond the personalities involved, and it extends in a direction that nobody in that Belgian press room in January 1945 could have anticipated. What Montgomery's press conference and Churchill's response established permanently, and without possibility of revision, was the foundational principle of modern coalition warfare, that in an alliance between unequal partners, the larger partner's dignity is not a courtesy, it is a structural requirement. Without it, the alliance does not function. Without it, the shared sacrifice that makes coalition warfare possible becomes impossible to sustain, because soldiers do not die willingly for a cause that their leaders are publicly describing as secondary to someone else's genius. This principle has been applied, tested, reconfirmed, and occasionally violated in every major military coalition since 1945. NATO's entire command structure is built on the assumption that American forces will be commanded by American generals at the highest level, that Allied contributions will be publicly acknowledged in proportion to their actual cost, and that no Allied commander will claim credit for outcomes produced primarily by another nation's blood. When these principles have been violated in the Suez Crisis of 1956, in various NATO disagreements during the Cold War, in coalition operations in the Middle East, the damage has followed a recognizable pattern, the same pattern that Montgomery produced in January 1945, requiring the same kind of careful diplomatic repair that Churchill performed in Parliament. The Battle of the Bulge itself has never left the consciousness of military history. It is studied in every serious military academy in the world. What is less often emphasized in that study is that the near fracturing of the Allied coalition in its aftermath was arguably as dangerous to the Allied cause as the German offensive itself. A German military breakthrough could be contained and reversed as it was. An alliance breakdown between Britain and America in January 1945 could not have been easily repaired. The war in Europe might have continued for additional months. The political settlement at its end would have looked different. The shape of post-war Europe, already being distorted by the decision to halt at the Elbe, might have been distorted further in ways impossible to fully calculate. Churchill's 4 paragraphs in Parliament prevented all of that. 38 American divisions versus 1 British corps. 60 to 80 American lives for every British life. Care must be taken not to claim an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. Those sentences delivered in 20 minutes on January 18, 1945, held together an alliance that had taken 4 years and millions of lives to build. They are among the most important sentences Churchill ever spoke. They are also among the least celebrated because they achieved their purpose by being corrective rather than inspirational, truthful rather than eloquent, precise rather than soaring. Now a detail that most accounts of this story omit entirely, and which reframes the entire episode in a way that is worth sitting with for a moment. Montgomery's press conference on January 7, 1945, was not entirely spontaneous. According to documents examined by historians in the decades after the war, including communications between Montgomery's headquarters and the British War Office, Montgomery had circulated advance notice of his press conference to British officials. He had, in effect, informed relevant parties in London that he was planning to address the press about the Battle of the Bulge and his role in it. Nobody stopped him. Nobody warned him. Nobody in the British military or political establishment thought to say, "Field Marshal, please consider the American reaction before you speak." This means the catastrophe was not simply the product of one man's ego operating in isolation. It was the product of a British institutional culture that had not yet fully internalized the new reality of Anglo-American relations, that Britain was no longer the senior partner that American generals could not be publicly condescended to, without consequences that extended to the highest political level, that the relationship required continuous and active maintenance rather than the casual assumption of natural British precedents. Montgomery was the most visible expression of that cultural failure, but he was not its only expression. He was simply the one who happened to be standing in front of a room full of reporters on January 7, 1945, with a pistol he had just fired and a story he was absolutely certain the world needed to hear. Churchill understood the deeper failure. That is why his parliamentary speech was not simply a correction of Montgomery's specific claims, but a statement of principle about how Britain and America needed to relate to each other going forward. Care must be taken, not just by Montgomery, by all of us, in telling our proud tale, in claiming credit, in presenting ourselves to the world and to our partners. From a pistol shot in a Belgian courtyard to a parliamentary speech that held the Western Alliance together at the moment of approaching victory, this is what the story of Churchill and Montgomery and the Battle of the Bulge actually teaches. Not simply that ego is dangerous, though it is. Not simply that diplomatic skill is valuable, though it is. It teaches that the relationships between nations, like the relationships between people, require constant tending, constant honesty, and the occasional willingness to stand up in public and say, "We did not do this alone, and we should not pretend that we did." 80,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in the Battle of the Bulge. They did almost all the fighting. They suffered almost all the losses. Churchill said so on the record in Parliament for history to preserve. That truth, stated clearly and without qualification, was the thing that saved the alliance. And the alliance, held together by that truth, went on to finish a war that changed the world. That is why the story is worth telling. And that is why the words Churchill spoke on January 18, 1945, deserve to be remembered not just by historians, but by anyone who has ever stood beside a partner in a difficult fight and wondered how to share the credit honestly when the fighting is done. If this story stayed with you, share it in the comments and tell us which part surprised you most. There are hundreds of moments like this in the history of the Second World War, moments where the war was almost lost, not to the enemy, but to the alliance itself. Subscribe and stay with us. We will keep finding them.